You're probably all growing impatient. We're still waiting for our keynote speaker to arrive. She could be here any minute. Henning, could you please respond to my chat? We're still waiting for our keynote speaker, but we will be with you shortly. Hello, everyone. We are still waiting for our keynote, but we decided to mix the program a bit and just start, because otherwise we will run out of time, which would be a shame. Hello all. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to our very first edition of ConNext and our very first session, Coatings and Surfaces. My name is Sophie Glerum, and I'm from the University of Amsterdam.
And my name is Vincent Kattersel, and I'm from the University of Antwerp.
And we will be hosting the session for today. And before we start, let's set up some basic rules for this and all forthcoming sessions. Please make sure your microphone and camera are turned off, just not to disturb the presenters during their talk and to save up some bandwidth. And we encourage you all to ask questions, and please do so in the chat only, so we can pick them out for the Q&A. And our sessions will be recorded for archival reasons and the possibility to open ConNext up towards the broader audience. Obviously, this will only happen with consent of all speakers. And finally, this is a conference for students by students, and please respect one another for their exceptional and remarkable effort of making this thing happen. And some of them will be presenting for a large audience for the very first time, so please keep that in mind. Next slide, please. So welcome to this very first session of ConNext. I'll give you just a short introduction, how ConNext came into being and what we try to achieve. And this is a joint effort of the conservation training programs of the Universities of Antwerp, Amsterdam, Hildesheim, Cologne, Potsdam, and Lincoln, all within the field of wood and furniture conservation, with some programs also having incorporated polychromy and modern materials, hence the wide variety in subjects for these ConNext sessions. And our ambition is to connect you, the students, with your international colleagues and give you the opportunity to share your work. We know these are strange times, especially for you who have had such different expectations of what your time at university would be like. But better days are ahead, and there's a bright light at the end of the tunnel. And one of the very few advantages of our getting used to these virtual environments is that it has made sharing our knowledge on an international level even easier, and we are more connected than ever. And speaking of international level, we have over 270 registered participants, all united from over 29 different educational programs and research institutes from 12 different countries. That is beyond a great turnout, better than we'd ever expected when we set this up. Education is paramount for the future of our field, and it starts with sharing stories, sharing your hard work, your experiences, and knowledge. And we hope that you will continue doing so for the rest of your studies and your professional life. As the organization of ConNext, we hope to lower the threshold for you to stand in an abstract for conferences like those of ICMCC, Ebonist, or Future Talks. So let ConNext be the start of an international network, because now we'll only meet each other virtually, but hopefully in the future we can have a drink together. So now we hope you are all as excited as we are to kick off this very first session of ConNext with one of the, well, we will skip the keynote for now and come back to that later. But we'll start with the presentation of Chen Liao. We are very proud to present her from the University of Lincoln. And her talk is about the reversibility of Paraloid B72 and microcrystalline wax on Urushi lacquerwares and the retreatability of these objects. So Chen, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me? Good evening, everyone. I'm Chen Liao from the University of Lincoln. Today, I would like to talk about my findings of my dissertation research. The topic is a preliminary investigation into the effects of B72 and Renaissance wax packs on the retreatability of photo-degraded East Asian lacquerwares using Urushi. The presentation is divided into four main sections: introduction, experiment, results, and conclusion. In the introduction section, I will briefly introduce what photodegradation is, what will happen when it occurs on lacquerware, how to treat photodegraded lacquerware, and the reason why I'm doing this research. The procedure, the materials, and the conditions for the experiment will be mentioned in the experiment section. Following will be the results, and finally the conclusion. Let's start from the introduction. When lacquerware exposed to light, the polymerized Urushi chain will break down and form lots of microcracks on the lacquer surface, as you can see from this picture. These microcracks could not be seen by naked eye, but will cause the loss of the luster of lacquerware. From this picture, this is the tissue box used as the experiment sample. This area of the box was covered by the lid, so it remains its original luster, while the other parts were exposed to light and become matte. Also, photodegradation will cause additional damages of lacquerware. For example, the polymerized lacquer surface is originally insoluble in most solvents, but it becomes polar solvent sensitive after light damage. Therefore, if it undergoes through an improper cleaning or fail to notice about the dew point, unremovable watermarks will leave on the lacquer surface. So, conservators frequently attempt to reinstate gloss and prevent further damages by applying synthetic coatings on aged surface. However, in waxbook, lacquer technology and conservation, she doubts of the removability of wax and mentioned that the wax residues might cause the lacquer unpolymerized, but no studies to date have confirmed this. In addition, some conservators in the East would possibly use Urushi to retreat lacquerwares previously coated with other materials to achieve the treatment requirements. So that's why this research topic was chosen, to investigate the retreatability using Urushi previously coated with synthetic materials. To narrow down the range of synthetic coatings, this research only focused on the two most commonly used materials, Paraloid B72 and Renaissance microcrystalline wax. An experiment was conducted to find out, first, if Paraloid B72 and Renaissance microcrystalline wax packs could be removed without residues, and second, if residues remained, would a retreatment with Urushi be affected? The experiment procedure is as follows. Prepare the samples and experiment material, applying B72 and Renaissance wax on the samples, artificially age the coated surfaces, and remove the coatings, and finally retreat with Urushi. Scanning electron microscope and FTIR spectroscopy were used to investigate if B72 and Renaissance wax were removed from the microcracks. The red triangles point out when both instruments were used, and the yellow one is only when SEM were used. For the sample and material preparation, as we can see on the left, this is the writing box. In the middle is the tissue box. They were naturally photo-degraded when found. The lids of them were the experiment samples, and the treatment materials was 2.5% weight value percentage B72 in xylene and the commercially available Renaissance wax paste. Next on is the application of the treatment. The lead were divided into 4 sections. B72 was brushed onto the upper left side for 2 times, and Renaissance wax was applied on the upper right section by cotton wool swab and then polished with clean soft cotton cloth. Moving on to the artificial aging. After the application of treatment, the edges of the lids were covered by tin foil to compare the effects before and after aging. Then they were put into an UV aging chamber, wavelengths mainly at 352 nanometer for 432 hours. After aging, 3 methods were tried to remove the coating: solvent on cotton swabs, agar solvent gel, and Fuller's Earth solvent putty. The solvents used for removal of B72 is xylene, and for Renaissance wax was white spirit. However, when conducting the removal with agar solvent gel and Fuller's Earth putty, some disadvantage of these 2 materials were found. As previously mentioned, photo-degraded lacquer surfaces are polar solvent sensitive. Therefore, in a lower middle picture, here the red arrow points out that the lacquer surface was dissolved by the polar solvent content gel and caused lots of pinholes to occur. So it is very unrecommended to use gels for cleaning photo-degraded Urushi objects. In terms of the disadvantages of Fuller's Earth proteins, the earth particle was stuck in the microcracks to blanch the surface, and they could hardly be removed afterward. We could see from the SEM images later. The last step of the experiment was to retreat the surfaces with Urushi. The application method was Urushi gatame. The main principle of Urushi gatame is that firstly apply diluted Urushi and wait for about 30 minutes for solvent evaporation, then wiping away excess Urushi with solvents on lint-free tissue, only remaining Urushi on in the microcracks, but not on the surfaces. Let's see the results of the experiment. First is the SEM image of before and after B72 and Renaissance wax treatment. From the images, it could be seen that due to the viscosity of B72, it could not fill in all the microcracks completely, but Renaissance wax could. That's why Renaissance wax could reach a very glossy finish with only 1 application, because the most the microcracks were filled, the most the gloss will return. Then go through the results of the removal of B72. From the images, we can see that B72 could be removed with cotton swabs. There is no residues in the microcracks. The removal of agar gel was suspended because it caused damages to the original surface. So B72 will still remain on the surface, as you can see here. And from this picture, it could be seen that Fuller's Earth was filled in the microcracks. So it is hard to distinguish if B72 was remanded. So FTIR absorbance spectral was used to double check if B72 was completely removed. The orange spectrum is the original lacquer surface, and the blue one is after B70 application. Red arrows points out the characteristic peaks of B72. The gray spectrum is the removal with cotton swabs, which the peaks of B72 disappeared and become similar to the original, showing that B72 was completely removed from the surfaces by cotton swabs. Now moving on to the result of Renaissance wax removal. From the images, we can see that the wax could not be removed from the micro cracks. It still remained in the cracks. Fuller's earth broke the micro cracks, so same as the result of B72, it is hard to see if wax had been removed. So confirmed with FTIR spectrum, the orange one is the original lacquer surface. The blue is after wet application, with which the red arrow indicates the characteristic peak of microcrystalline wax. The peak only become lower but not disappeared after the removal methods were tried, showing that the wax could only be reduced but not be completely removed. Now let's go to the result after retreatment. B72 could be removed, so it did not affect the retreatment of Urushi. Even wax remained in the microcracks as the red arrow pointed. The Urushi still could dry or say polymerize. However, the wax residue blanched the original color of lacquer, and due to the translucency of the thin coating of Urushi, the color of the finished lacquer retreatment at the wax section was slightly different than the other. In conclusion, let's return to our two research questions. First, if B72 and Renaissance wax could be removed without residues, the answer is that B72 could be completely removed simply with cotton wool swabs, but Renaissance wax would remain as residues in the microcracks. Second, if residue remained, would a retreatment with Urushi be affected? The answer is that wax residue did not impede the polymerization of Urushi, but it would affect the finished appearance to have slight blanch the original color. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your listening and your attention.
So, hello and welcome to my presentation. I'm gonna stop the video because otherwise the internet will not work with me. So, hello and welcome to my presentation, Calculating Conservation, Finding Measures for an Object Used in an Open-Air Museum. I'm Franziska Eber and I'm a student in my semester at the Köln Institute of Conservation Sciences, specializing in wood and modern materials. I will first give you a quick introduction into the object we'll be talking about, its construction and the main problems with its condition. Then we're going to take a look at its values and the future exhibition conditions and where these conditions had to be calculated into the conservation and restoration concept to find the right measures, which I will then present to you. But yeah, let's head right to it. The ongoing research project is about a calculating instrument from the Freilichtmuseum Lindlar, the Lindlar Open Air Museum in North Rhine-Westphalia. Since 2019, it is within the workshops of the KICS in Cologne. It is a mathematical calculating tool from approximately around the 19th century, with which the basics of arithmetics can be taught. After the ongoing treatment, it will be presented as a part of the permanent exhibition Bildungsgeschichte, History of Education, presumably summer 2021. It will be shown in a historic school building from Waldpool-Hermersdorf. It is built as a dark standing wooden frame out of spruce wood with 10 horizontally installed metal wires on which 100 balls are slit. The frame pieces are joined at the upper corners with a handmade open thong and dovetail joint. The central bar below was built into construction with a mortise and tenon joint, as were the frame feet. The frame stands on these 2 feet, and in the inner corners of the frame construction are wooden triangles screwed on. A thin cover strip with nails is attached to the outer leather surfaces. The 10 metal wires are pushed onto the frame with the balls onto them. So pushed in right here. On the top 5 rows, there are 5 balls on the left and 5 dark balls on the right. And on the 5 wires below, the division is the other way around. The balls are turned and can be moved within their wire to calculate with them. The heavy usage of the balls in the past due to the history and obvious function of it has left the surface polluted with a mixture of dust and skin grease that is strongly bonded to especially the white paint layer. In the picture on the left, you can see its current condition. This paint is made of an oil-bound binder pigment mixture in crystalline form, which you can see here in this microscope picture of a small sample. You can see the opaque dirt layer here and how it is covering the surface and the color of the paint. Both the paint and the dirt show similar dissolving behavior. They are sparingly soluble. Up close in a stereo microscope, you can see the dirt layer and the condition of it. The use of the balls also led to a delimitation between the wood and the paint, which caused loads of voids. The separation of the layers of paint from the wood is visible in the form of chipped paint clots, some of which have lodged effects up to the wood base that you can see right here. This is the wooden base, and this is the dirty paint layer. A network of fractures and cracks also formed in the paint layer. They are partly isolated and have partly expanded into a connected network. Individual parts of the paint layer have separated from the wood, as you saw in the picture. The edges of the cracks and the spellings are angular. Here you can see the paint under ultraviolet radiation. The strong blue color is due to the used UV lamp. Nevertheless, you can see the white paint shining brightly from the broken edges of flaked paint clots under the layer of dirt. So you can see right here. There are 2 kinds of fluorescences to be seen. A bright whitish area, which is the wooden base right here, and a very bright whitish area around these here, which is the original fluorescence of the paint. On the surface, the fluorescence is not too bright because of the dirt layer covering the surface, and therefore the fluorescence is not shining through. The paint layer is very unstable and lies partially loose on the wood support, which is why it must be consolidated and cleaned before it can be used in the exhibition. Before we look into ways to consolidate and preserve, we have to take a look at the different values of the instrument. It is from big sociological meaning as well as cultural and historical significance, and therefore worth preserving for future generations. The object itself has an educational value because it is a testimony to the development of German school history. Thus, the machine is not only to be regarded as a technical device, but as an object of everyday culture. It is of great sociological significance. Because of the everyday use of it in school, as you can see exemplified in this picture, it is not only a testimony to the history of mathematics and education, but also of the development of school equipment around the 19th century. In addition to this, there is a functional value. Some may say it is the most important value. The original function and therefore its use for the society results from the use. It played a not insignificant role in school lessons to illustrate the learning content of arithmetics. But the possibilities of the calculator go far beyond the calculation of the 4 basic arithmetic operations. The simple mechanics of the calculator also make it possible to calculate numbers in the billions. And this focus on the importance of the function is only emphasized by the simple construction of the object itself. This value also continues to exist even if it is not used on a daily basis, because the item itself is representing it with the existing traces of the former use. The museum wants to occasionally use it in a permanent exhibition for educational purposes and to illustrate the function of it as a calculating device to the museum visitor. Now we know, with the use of it, what future purpose the device has to fulfill. If we now mentally place it in its future exhibition context, the Bildungsgeschichte exhibition, it could look like something like you can see in this picture. And you can see a calculating tool here and also right here in the corner. The pictures show 2 examples on how an open-air museum can portray the historical school buildings around the 19th and 20th century. On the left side, Pellau in Austria and Common in North Rhine-Westphalia on the right side. The museum, well, the owner probably wants to show the calculating device in something similar. The Lindem Museum in general focuses to build the surrounding landscape as it looked like in the 19th century. On 25 hectares, the grounds are built and cultivated according to historical models. The main goal of the exhibition pursues a pictorial demonstration by integrating the calculating tool into the overall context of an exemplarily recreated school lesson that is focused on the function of it. This creates the possibility to put the item in its earlier living and working conditions and recreate the possible original environment. According to the museum, it will be placed on a platform and out of reach for the normal visitor. Other than this, the exhibition will be in a historic building. This leads to certain prevailing conditions and additional risk factors that need to be considered in the following decision-making progress. First of all, the unstable climate. In a museum, the object will be exposed to a permanently fluctuating climate. A historic building cannot meet the modern requirements which are represented by current advisors for a normal museum environment. For mixed collections, including the material combination of wood and iron, stable conditions of 20 to 24 degrees and relative humidity of about 55% are recommended. But in a historic building, the collections will be exposed to the natural oscillations of the climate from summer to winter and vice versa, as well as it will be exposed to a wide variety of environmental influences. The other additional risk factor is already mentioned use of the calculating tool. The function of it must be guaranteed, and it is to be used in the future. These risk factors lead to different problems that the object has to face in its future. The unstable climate leads to environmental stress. The risk of internal stress due to fluctuating temperature and humidity and other external influences have to be taken into the decision to find appropriate measures. The future use of the calculating tool itself leads to mechanical stress. The back and forth movement of the balls itself, but also the balls on the metal wires, put the compounds under increased mechanical stress to which they would not be exposed to if the item would just not be used. Which is why the conservation concept requires additional preventive measures that build a good middle ground for the right amount of measures that gives good protection to the cultural property so that it can serve its purpose in the museum. The additional required preventive measures contain climate control to keep the environmental stress as low as possible, as well as an additional protective layer to prevent material loss due to the mechanical stress of the use of the calculator. You may now ask yourself, why not just eliminate at least one of the factors and save you the work by just not using the object? This will not only save you time, but also material cost and energy in the conservation of it. But as I mentioned earlier, the function of the calculating tool is the object's use for the society, and the museum requested to use it. The ACCO Professional Guidelines Code of Ethics, Article 6 says, quote beginning, the conservator restorer, in collaboration with other professional colleagues involved with cultural heritage, shall take into account the requirements of its social use while preserving the cultural heritage, quote end. So as I said, the required function of the tool is the social use of it, and the wish of the owner is exactly this use. Therefore, it has to be considered in the decision-making progress. All of this, together with the values and state of it, and the consideration of the future exhibition context, and the additional risk and required measures, are the basis for the conservation and restoration concept, which brings me to the goals of the current work in progress. My goals for the measures are to extend the lifespan of not only the object, but also the material and the measures itself, by choosing suitable materials that are more weather resistant and therefore can withstand the changing climate and the conditions in the historic building of the open air museum, while still maintaining removable in the future. Secondly, I want to the compounds from loss of material and prevent future damage by consolidating loose parts and especially the loose paint layer. I also want to maintain the authenticity of the object that it can maintain to represent its values and its history. The measures that will be carried out or have been carried out at this point, since it is a work in progress, involve the installing of a specialized heating system in the building that meet the requirements of an open-air museum. It will compensate excessive temperature differences and regulate fluctuating temperature up to a certain point. All of this will be supported by the permanent monitoring of the conditions. The consolidation of the paint layer that you can see right here in this picture will be carried out with the more weather-resistant Plextool B500 instead of, for example, an enamel glue. The tool is also more resistant to mechanical stress. The cleaning of the dirt layer of the paint will only take place after its consolidation. The cleaning is with an alkali PG solution system of calcium hydroxide and polyglycol. Clean the surface after the consolidation due to its chemical and physical characteristics. An additional protective layer will be put onto the metal wires after they have been freed from rust. The layer will not only protect the metal from environmental and climatic influences that will cause a new corrosion of it, but it will also protect from the mentioned use. The layer will consist of an acrylic resin instead of the normal used wax coating that could only prevent from environmental influences, but is not mechanically resistant. For the balls, the Plextool B500 is already mechanically resistant. An additional protective coating can be considered. In conclusion, it is important to recognize and understand the object in its entirety in order to also evaluate the owner's wishes. These should always be respected and, if ethnically justifiable, included in the restoration and conservation concept. In the case of the calculating tool discussed here, the wishes of the museum were taken into considerations and implemented, and the additional necessary protective measures were then developed. As I mentioned before, the project is still in progress, so I have only begun to carry out the measures, so further questions and challenges will certainly arise, which can then be addressed. Thank you all for listening, and in the following I will share my bibliography with you, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Chen. Thank you very much, Franziska, for those excellent talks to start our first ConNext session with. So now it's, wait a minute. So now it's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Shayne Rivers. Shayne Rivers is an acknowledged world expert in the conservation of furniture and Asian lacquer and has lectured and educated students pretty much all around the world. Shayne graduated in 1989 at the Royal College of Art and the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And from 1999 to 2015, she worked as a furniture and decorative surfaces conservator at the V&A. But many of you might know Shayne best for her reference work, Conservation of Furniture, which she wrote together with Nick and me. This work was first published in 2003. Shayne currently holds a position as a subject leader in the master program Collections, Care and Conservation Management at Western College in the United Kingdom. So Shayne, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vincent. I'd firstly like to apologise for being slightly late to the conference. This is a note to self, make sure you get your international timings right. I thought I'd check them 3 times and I clearly hadn't checked them enough. So with that apology out of the way, I thought that I would talk to you this evening about decision making in conservation. And I'm going to use an example that fits with the surface coatings theme of tonight. So my first student project when I was doing my Masters in Conservation at the V&A was the treatment of this Charles Rennie Mackintosh smoker's cabinet, which I did in 1995. And it was the very first object that I had when I came into the museum. And Charles Rennie Mackintosh is a really important Scottish designer and very important in British history of design and history of furniture. Those Star Trek fans among you might spot his chairs, which periodically pop up in episodes of Star Trek. So the key thing here is that the flaps were warped, and the only thing that we knew was about this yellow inlay, that it was called Erinoid. And it was typical of the challenges that students face, which was, how far should I go? There's no specific information out there on this problem, and I'm not sure what to do. So I thought that that was probably a familiar feeling to all of you. And I thought that I would say to you, unfortunately, in my experience, it's not a feeling that goes away. Very, very often you're confronted with objects in your professional life where that uncertainty and those questions stay the same. So I thought that this evening I would talk about my approach to decision making in those situations where I'm not sure about what I should do, and that I would do that using a case study from the Mazarin chest, and that I would look at the consolidation of the photo-degraded surface. And to do that, I'm going to introduce the object, I'm going to introduce the problem, I'm going to set out my approach, and then at the end, I'm going to draw some connections between conservation and social justice, and how that approach can help us navigate some more complex problems than just the object. So this is the Mazarin chest. It's from the late 1630s. It's Japanese export lacquer. And it's a chest size object. For those of us, we're all furniture conservators, so the size of a regular, tool chest or blanket chest or similar is how big this object is. And it is decorated to within an inch of its life, in tremendous detail. So this, and it incorporates a whole range of techniques, any one of which appear on a multitude of Japanese objects, but there's no equivalent object in Japan which has all of these decorative techniques on one object. So it's a really significant object. So this is an image of the inside of the lid of the chest, and I'm going to take you just to look in detail at that part where the arrow is pointing, which is where the boat's going under the bridge. So overall, this inside of the lid is over 1 metre wide. And if we go into the detail that you can see there, what you can see is that the boat going under the bridge is about 10 centimetres long. And you can see the detail that's gone into the waves, that each of the beams for the bridge has sprinkled decoration on it. If you go in further and you look at the figures in the bridge, the man in the centre of that image is about 1 centimetre tall. And you can see the amount of detail that's gone into decorating and representing the textiles that he's wearing. But if you go in one step further, this is the face of the man, and that's 3 millimetres from the top of his head to his chin. So just go back again to that first image that I showed you of the inside of the chest, and remember the whole of the chest, and think about all of the detail that goes into that whole object. So this guy, 3 millimetres his head is, and he's got a facial expression, he's got the windswept hair, he's even got a little moustache painted in. So that's the introduction to the object. The problem that I wanted to talk you through tonight is the light damage that you get on lacquer, and the fact that it leads to unstable decoration. So many of you will hopefully know that Asian lacquer is susceptible to light damage, and that it causes a series of formation of fine microcracking all over the surface, and that microcracking causes a loss of gloss. I'm less concerned about the loss of gloss than I am from the loss of the surface decoration, which I'm going to show you how that happens now. So this is a oblique SEM of the light damaged surface. So you've got those vertical cracks that you could see from that previous image. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is these horizontal cracks that are happening. So you've got these islands forming in between the microcracks, and then the tops of the islands are susceptible to this additional horizontal cracking. And what that means is that you end up with the loss of the surface layer and the loss of the decoration. So when this object was treated, which was probably about between 15 and 10 years ago, the general approach in the West was to either do nothing or to wax. And I was reviewing websites as I was preparing this talk, and lots of websites still recommend wax. And interestingly, they all quite like carnauba wax. Nobody really likes varnishes because it doesn't replicate the look of the lacquer. And in Japan, of course, they're using an irreversible lacquer-based treatment, in which they're using lacquer diluted in solvent to consolidate the surface. So those describe the problem and generally describe the choices we had. And when we talked about these choices with our conservation community and with the people who were interested in the object, it became clear that the debate was being framed as a series of binary choices. So the debate was between, would we take a Western approach or a Japanese approach? Was it acceptable to use irreversible materials, or should we only be talking about using reversible materials? Should we use, and as part of that, synthetic materials, or should we use only natural materials? And there were tremendously strong feelings on both sides. So at one of the presentations that I gave, a Japanese woman got up and with significant amount of passion said to use anything other than urushi on a lacquer object, and urushi is the Japanese word for lacquer, to use anything other than Japanese lacquer on a Japanese object would be like feeding poison to your baby. And when I went to ICOM and presented a discussion about this object, a Western conservative, who was actually from the States, stood up and said it was absolutely outrageous and unethical that we could even consider using an irreversible object. So it was a significant debate, and I have to say there was a lot of emotion on both sides. And the thing that I think I've taken away from that is that when you're faced with that kind of binary choice, and it's a very extreme choice between those two things, the thing that I've learned from that is that it tells you, the fact that you get yourself into that situation is that it tells you you're asking the wrong question. So what I would suggest is that you need to take a step back and say, what is it that we care about, and what is it that I'm really trying to achieve? So with that in mind, I think that for all objects in conservation, when you're making your decision about what you're going to do and how you're going to approach it, you're asking three big questions. And the first one is, what am I aiming for and why? The second one is, what's the best treatment choice and why? And the third one is, within the framework of that, what material or technique would be the best and why? And what you'll notice about that is that what you're actually asking at each stage is what matters and why. And those are the hard questions, and it's the adding and why to each one that shifts you away from the binary choice and moves you into really understanding what it is that you're trying to achieve. And that's when you start being able to have a discussion, and we get two people who might appear to be on opposite sides of the table starting to get on the same side of the table and approaching the problem together. So the first question, what am I aiming for and why, pretty much defines everything else that follows. And really that question is about asking what matters about this object and why. And that expresses the idea of what do we value about this object and why. So I was really pleased to see the previous speaker talking about what the values associated with their object were. And then the other key thing is what's valued and by whom. And conservators have been talking and thinking about value for at least 20 years. So the Getty did a great project in the early 2000s. Those publications are available free online. But I highly recommend this publication, in which it's complexity simplified. They've taken 20 years of conservation literature and thinking around values, and they've reduced it down to its essence. So in the same way that the CCI sat down and said, what are all the things that break objects, and came up with 10 agents of deterioration, the ICN sat down and said, what are the values associated with objects, and came up with a group of values. So the first of those is the features and attributes, and they're value neutral. So the condition, the completeness, whether it's part of an ensemble or not, whether it has provenance or not, whether it's rare or whether it's very representative of a particular type, those things are objective, and it's fairly straightforward for people to agree or disagree on those. The other categories that they came up with are the values, and those are subjective. And they break them down into three groupings of subjective values. The first one is what they call cultural historical, and they grouped historic values, artistic values, and the informational values, so the materials and techniques that an artist or a maker has used. The next one was the social and societal, so into that they grouped social meaning, spiritual meaning, identities, meaning, and personal significance that an object might have. And then the other category that they use is usability. So how can the object be used? So they talked about presentation, education, so display when they say presentation, education, research, but also its use within a business, its reputational impact, and using it to generate income. And then because they're particularly forward thinking, and I have, my hat's off to the ICN. I think they're a really great bunch of people. They've added a fifth category, which is other. So what they've done in that is acknowledge that there is a range for other values to come to the fore, and that you should always be looking for things that you haven't thought of. So there is a fifth one, which is the thing I haven't thought of yet, which is other. So if you look at those values, I think it's really important to understand that when it comes to the object, it's not, conservation isn't about the object or the material, it's about preserving what we care about that object or material. And that means that conservation is not about, for us as furniture conservators, not about fixing bits of wood or fixing surface finishes per se, but it's about taking a step back and saying, what is it that makes this object worth preserving, and what is it that a range of people value about it that make it not just a pile of wood? And once you know what matters and why and to whom, that gives a clearer framework for answering the next questions, which are what's the best treatment choice and why, and what material and technique are best and why. And the reason for that is because the reason that it gives a clearer framework is because you move away from, should I choose Japanese and Western, to, of all the choices that I have, which one preserves where the value lies in this object? And that's a different question, and that's how you untangle those binary choices, is you move away from them. So when you look at the Mazarin chest and you look at what was being conserved and why, when we were consulting, what became clear is that the understanding and by this object is, if it was in Japan, it would be considered a national treasure. It's very, very highly valued in Japan, and it's considered, probably the most significant export lacquer object in the world of its type. So the understanding in Japan and in the UK, and I would argue probably all around the world, of those value neutral attributes was shared. There was no discussion about its condition or its provenance or its rarity. Those things were absolutely agreed on. The cultural and historic values were shared. Everybody could understand that it was historically important, artistically important, that it embodied a significant amount of information about the artistic skill. And in the ICOM 2005 article where this was discussed, you'll see those things mentioned as rarity, aesthetics, and craft skills. But where the values diverged and where those emotional disputes came from was that the social and societal values diverged between the West and Japan. So I use Western values because, of course, there are a wide range of cultures in the West as well. There is no one monolithic Western culture. So I use these in a generalized communication way, not because I believe we're all the same. But broadly speaking, what you have is an individualistic culture which values an individual artist's expression. And what became clear is that the divergence was that the Japanese values came from a consensus culture with a strong sense of community, where cultural continuity and the importance of tradition were really important. And a significant importance is given to the uniqueness of Japan. And those of us experiencing right-wing backlashes and, you know, substitute your country in here exceptionalism, will appreciate that that uniqueness can have positives and negatives in the current climate. So when you look at limiting the loss of value, that we're looking about what matters about the Mazarin chest, why does that matter, and who does it matter to, and then how can we preserve what matters about this object. So a key part of that process is to engage in stakeholder consultation. So it's about working out who you think needs to be consulted, has an interest in this object, and then taking them on board. So the way that we did this was to engage in a collaborative treatment between myself and a really experienced and with a high, really outstanding level of expertise, Japanese conservator, Yoshihiko Yamashita, and we worked on the object together on and off over the period of 3 years. So in terms of navigating the choices, we're looking at photo-degraded lacquer surfaces. And when you look at those and you pull apart your problem, nothing that you do is reversible. And if we were to put on any sort of coating that in theory could be redissolved, what we know is that removing those coatings will definitely cause more damage. And by cause more damage, I mean cause the loss of more surface decoration. We know that putting on lacquer-based treatments provides long-term stabilisation because we did a research project that demonstrated the case. So having moved away from reversible and non-reversible, we moved to those key values, which were preservation of the object, which was the absolute highest priority for all of the stakeholders, and then an additional emphasis on cultural continuity. Now, there are no, at any one point, either of those things need to be balanced and discussed. That's not an absolute answer. But what it meant that shifting away from that into what do we care about and why, and what are the things that constrain our choices, meant that we opted for something called an Urushi gatame treatment. So Urushi is the lacquer, gatame means consolidation in Japanese. And in that treatment, you have your lacquer, it gets diluted in solvent, it's brushed onto the surface and allowed to soak into the surface. And then any excess is removed from the absolute, from the exterior layer. But most of the lacquer that you put on stays within the surface. It's an irreversible treatment. You then humidify the lacquer, it turns into a three-dimensional network, and you are never going to get it out. But that means that, so it is an irreversible treatment, but it absolutely, all the participants of the project were absolutely happy that this would preserve the object and that it would preserve the value of the object. So this is an image of the Urushi gatame as it's applied to the surface. So what you can see is that you get a wetting effect, so you can always see where it's been, but that's not a permanent effect because you remove it from the surface. So you put it on and then you wipe the excess off, so you can see on that cloth the excess coming off. And then in this final image, you can see the background going back to the way that it was as the last of the excess Urushi is removed from that inlay. So what I would emphasise is that there are no magic answers in conservation. It depends. And that's all about using reflective judgment. So Urushi gatame is not always appropriate for all objects. It depends. It doesn't always work. It depends. And in this case, it didn't work and it was removed before it was it dried. So as always, in conservation, somewhat frustratingly, it depends. So taking a step back, one of the things that I would like to move on to in terms of those values is, in terms of conservation, who decides? Who decides whether something that's made of wood is firewood or whether it's an object? And part of who decides that is whose voices are heard. And when I talk to people, and I think about myself, and you ask people, why do we preserve cultural heritage? If you ask a conservator and they're really honest, generally they'll say, I like the work, I enjoy the work that I do, whether that, whether it's metals or furniture or paintings, and also it feels meaningful. And those are the reasons why each of us individually, if you've got other reasons, put them into chat. I'd be delighted to hear them. Those are the reasons that individually we got into conservation. But if you take a step back and say, why do we preserve cultural heritage at all? I mean, really, with the problems in the world, why do we do this? Why is this worth spending our time and our money on rather than anything else? And normally I do this as a workshop in a class, and it takes people an hour to come to this answer. So you should all feel very happy that I haven't put you through that torment. But the key that I think about why we preserve cultural heritage is that it captures and allows us to tell stories of our past. Those are stories about who we are, and sometimes they're stories about who we aren't. They're always stories about how we got from where we were to where we are now. They typically are used to express values that we think are important to us, and they both shape and define our identity. And all of those things mean that one of the reasons that museums are a focus for what are called culture wars in the US and the UK are that those stories are disputed. And I hope that as many of you as can are participating in the webinars that are being held all over the world at the moment, and in the context of Black Lives Matters and other power imbalances. This is one of several that I've attended recently, which is you can find it on YouTube. But what I draw your attention to is the title of this is really telling. It is really significant, and in that these conservators, the people who were giving this presentation, were talking about telling our own story. So the key takeaway for conservators that I have from listening to many of those discussions and from my own practice as a conservator is that as conservators, we typically don't choose the objects or interpret the stories. We react to objects that are brought to us, or we, if we're working in a museum, somebody else is choosing what objects to collect, or people are bringing objects that are significant to them to us for conservation. But the flip side of that is that even though we don't get to choose those objects and tell the stories, we do get to have a voice and to amplify other people's voices in what matters about what gets preserved about those objects. And the key part of that is about consulting all the stakeholders, listening to them and respecting them. And in that previous slide and in that Mazarin chess project, I think what you've got is a framework for doing that makes a really positive example for conservation decision making. So I hope that that's been helpful. If you've got any questions, I'm delighted to hear them. And I'm not sure how, the moderators will keep us on. So I'm going to go into chat and look at the things. Over to you, Vincent.
Okay, thank you, Shayne. Thank you so much for this inspiring talk and sharing these exquisite images of the Mazarin chest. I think you did a good thing choosing the Mazarin chest and its conservation treatment to just mark and highlight the complexity of our own decision making, and also to stay focused and stay, should I say it, critical about our own decision making as a conservator. And lastly, but not least, at the end, you said you have to listen to the stakeholders, and indeed you have the stakeholders from the museum, those who are providing your work, but obviously it is also the colleagues that are extremely important and should be involved in this process as well. And I think that's one of the reasons why we set up ConNext as well, to do some networking, to get to learn each other, and to learn from each other. So thank you very much.
You're very
next
welcome.
we have, yeah, thank you. Next we have a short Q&A session, and I've seen quite a few questions in the chat box. So let's first start with Yun Chen. Yun Chen, could you unmute your microphone, please, so you can answer? And the first question that I have for you is, why did you choose to test the Paraloid B72 and the Renaissance wax? Oh yeah, sorry, we have to make you a presenter.
Hello. I chose B72.
Sorry for that. Sorry.
It's fine. I chose B72 because it appears in many current literature for treating photo-degraded Japanese lacquerware, and the Renaissance wax is commonly used in practice for lacquer treatment in the West. So I chose these two materials for my research.
Okay, perfect. So let's skip to the next question from Alma Ben Yossef. So she said, you said that the underlying wax did not adversely affect the polymerization of the Urushi retreatment, but could you also give us some insights on the effect of the adhesion? Because those are two different things. You have the polymerization and you have the adhesion.
Yeah, but I haven't think of this before, but thank you for this question. The retreatment of Urushi coating is very thin. So currently I am not sure how to measure the adhesion.
Sorry, could you repeat that last one?
Because the coating is very thin on the surface, so currently I'm not sure how to measure the adhesion of it.
Mm-hmm. But did you see any visual observations? Did you have the impression that the adhesion was not all right, or?
No, because it's combined very well with the object, so but I couldn't measure in a scientific way currently.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. We now have some
you.
questions for Franziska. Sophie?
Yes, thank you, Vincent, and thank you, Yung Chen, for answering those questions. Franziska, we have several questions for you, and both Welmoed and Andreas asked, since skin grease is a natural patina of use, would you think of, is it a consideration to not remove it?
So I thought about not removing it, but the dirt, like the layer of dirt on the paint, has a clear color impression on the surface. So it partially distorts the overall picture. And also the dirt layer could have a further influence on the paint layer, which we yet don't know of. So the cleaning, yeah, so this is why I chose to clean it, because it has the color impression and it changes the surface and the overall picture of the object.
Okay, thank you. And then Uncle Tom asked if you've thought of a consolidant for using.
Yeah, I said that I will use Plextool B500. It's an aqueous dispersion based on ethyl acrylate and metacrylate. And yeah, so I did a few test series on how the paint layer is responding to the material. And when I apply it with a brush and directly remove the excess, the excess material, I do get a satisfactory consolidation effect without leaving any residue on the surface.
Okay, that sounds great. And another question is, have you thought of reinstating its function and maybe by using a reproduction?
I did thought about it, but the object itself, because it is used in the open air museum, and it's quite hard to understand the thought process on this, because to build a reconstruction is quite time consuming, and you could also, I mean, at least we in Germany, we have these little calculators for kids to learn how to calculate. At least I did it in like first grade or second grade to learn to calculate. So most visitors are actually familiar with the concept of using it, and they have seen one before and how it works, but they will occasionally use it in the museum, in the exhibition, just to refresh this, probably this memory that most of us have from our early like childhood.
Okay, thank you, Franziska. Now there's another question from Alma Ben Yossef in the chat, and she asks a question for Shayne. You pointed out the importance of perspectives and our duty to amplify critical voices, and this subject bothers her a lot. And Alma says, I was never in a position in the museum to estimate what our role is and how we can contribute to decolonization processes from within the system. I think it might not be an easy answer to that.
Well, Alma, I'm delighted that this bothers you a lot, because I would like to think that it bothers us all a lot. One of the interesting things for me is that my life before conservation and as a conservator has always been one of a social justice activist. When I was 15, I was involved in gay rights demonstrations on the streets of Sydney. I spent my 18th birthday in prison protesting for having been arrested for protesting in an anti-war protest. And I've been involved in those direct action things all my life. So I think it's really hard when these things are brought to your attention in some ways for the first time, to know what to do and how to do it. And I think the very first step is that one that I talked about, which is about listening to the voices of the people who you want to amplify. So the first thing I would suggest is that you need to look at power relationships, who's got the power and who doesn't, because the people without the power are the people whose voices aren't going to be heard within our museums. So on a day-to-day basis, I'd be looking at all of those isms that represent power imbalances. So if you're looking at working with women and you're a woman, then act as an ally to amplify their voices. So if you're in a meeting and a woman says something and that gets ignored and picked up a few minutes later by somebody else and then gets taken off, then intervene and say, I think that's a great idea, and it's really fantastic that you've picked up that person's idea and taken it forward. So I think, and that's also true around disability, and it's absolutely true around race and racism. So I think when you're looking at decolonisation, I've attended several webinars recently, of which, thank you, Irene, that is the webinar, and I tried to put up the information that would allow you to track it. So the key message that I have received as I've listened to those webinars is that the thing is about museums is that what gets collected, museums in some way represent a society's collective memory. So in terms of the function of your memory has two functions. One is to remember what it thinks is important and what matters to it. And the second is to forget stuff that isn't. If we remembered everything that we could possibly remember in our lives, we'd all go crazy. And in a sense, that's the challenge of curation, is choosing what gets collected and what doesn't. Well, that's all very well. And that's where most work around decolonising collections comes into. It comes into what's in your collection and how is it how is it named, and who gets to name it and who gets to bring meaning to it. And those are things that are outside our control. So I think as conservators, what we have to do is look at the object and really take a step back and say, what are the power relationships that get expressed in this object? Whose voices aren't being heard? And how can I make sure that those voices are being heard? And to be honest, a lot of the time, if you're dealing with, you know, an object that comes from within your culture, that, you know, where the meaning is fairly clear, sometimes that's not very contested. But I think that when you come across an object where power imbalances are expressed in the collection or the potential treatment of their object or its description, then I think the way that you contribute to that is by trying to give voice to the people whose voices who aren't usually heard. So I hope that helps. I don't think it's easy. And I'll stop right there. But I think it's fantastic that that's a question that's occupying you. I think that speaks well of you, indeed.
Okay, thank you very much, Shayne. We now have to proceed to our little break of 10 minutes. So we'll see each other again at 2036 CST. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a lovely little break over there. So first off, after the break is Alma Ben Yossef. Just like Franziska, Alma is a master student from the Cologne Institute of Conservation, and she will present a case study of a photo-degraded surface finish on a Biedermeier cabinet and the methods she explored to recoating it. Alma, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
And you see? Okay. So good evening, everybody. Thank you for the ConNext team for organizing this event and for the opportunity to share my work with you. In this talk, I present highlights from my bachelor thesis, treatment proposal for a photo-degraded cabinet surface finish, removal and recoating strategies. The late Biedermeier secretary cabinet combines a high chest of drawers with a floor front secretary, a typical multifunctional piece of middle-class furniture, combining everyday utility with representative demands. It is dated approximately to 1840 and originates in either North Germany or Scandinavia. It is constructed from soft and hardwood in 3 removable parts: base, corpus, and hood. Other than the lion paw feet, the elegant rounded corner moldings, the most prominent feature of the cabinet's design draws on the decorative value of the natural wooden texture. The characteristic crotch mahogany figure is banded horizontally on the front surfaces, creating a symmetrical, swirling, darker pattern. This piece is a private feature. Its family ownership is accounted for 3 generations. It was brought to the CICS for investigation and treatment, which should ideally result in a restored functionality and appearance. Previous work conducted in our department formed the basis of my research. Documentation and analysis are largely contributions of the student Lea Hensler. Further relevant tests were done by the student Marcel Miklos. In 2018, our lecturer, Mr. Andreas Kupa, published an article about the cabinet. My project focuses on the cabinet surface, and more precisely on its photo-degraded condition. As you can see, the unevenly distributed areas correspond to the incident of light from a neighboring window. These disturb the visual appreciation of the object, especially when juxtaposed with the well-preserved interior secretary compartment. A previous conservational attempt to regenerate the existing coating could not resolve this discrepancy in appearance. The current aim is to aesthetically integrate the degraded areas with the better preserved ones. The main discovery of my predecessors was the identification of the presumably original historical finish of the cabinet surface, namely the Urushi technique, for a lack of an exact as a surface preparation method. This combines sanding with grain filling and staining. By anointing the substrate with a pumice stone, the pores are slowly filled by the pumice dust and abraded wood bound in oil. This renders the surfaces not only perfectly smooth, but provides deep saturation of the natural wooden color, accentuating its figure. The incorporation of red colorants, soluble or dispersed in oil, was mostly recommended for mahogany and as a preparatory step before a polished top coat. This structure or stratigraphy could be observed in cross sections. Using oil-detecting fluorescent dyes, here fluorescing in orange. From bottom to top, the wooden substrate is impregnated with oil, which barely forms a film. A continuous level film of shellac follows on top. Large particles of the colored resin dragon's blood are detected inside pores. Both dragon's blood and the shellac top coat were identified using FTIR. Raking light microscopy assisted in characterizing the condition of the shellac top coat. Crazed, brittle, and matte on exposed surfaces, yellowed but intact and still reflective on and Just a minute, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, just a second. Okay.
No problem.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So shellac top coat, crazed, brittle, and matte, yellowed but intact on protected surfaces. And remnants of dragon blood coloration could be identified on exposed surfaces only inside pores. A bit small, this image, but these small dots. And whereas protected surfaces demonstrated various degrees of preservation with local discoloration and initial fading. Differences in fluorescence under UV radiation assist in characterizing this discrepancy in conditions. Protected surfaces are still identifiable as shellac due to the typical orange or fluorescence. The bleaching of the wood is very pronounced here on this image of the secretary compartment drawer. This line on its left marks exactly the exposure border when compared to the right side, which was protected. In order to resolve this discrepancy, we tried to make the case for a justified restorative intervention, which takes the decorative features of the object and the finding of traditional methods into consideration. A complete reconstruction, as seen on the test board to the right, is not an option since the protected surfaces, here on top, are in good condition. The restoration will therefore aim at something in the middle, to match the appearance of the different surfaces and, if possible, retain wood figure saturation. Methods should be found that will fulfill these requirements while preserving as much original media as possible, as well as wood patina, and we here the signs of use or unique surface topography, as I call it. With regards to removal, the existing coating will be either kept, reduced, or locally replaced, and corresponding strategies for the prospective recoating were to be tested. Here I am highlighting the two main options. Strategy 1 proposes an intervention on the surface. The entire coating system will be kept, and color matching will follow on top of it while overlaying existing shellac with fresh shellac glazes. The colored teardrops in this illustration refer to the added colorants, red hues for compensating the fading of the finish, and brown hues bleaching of the wood. Strategy 2 proposes an intervention at the interface, in which case the degraded top coat will be removed selectively, sparing the underlying preparation layers. Afterwards, a sequence of oil impregnations followed by shellac glazes will be applied, aiming to achieve both color matching and accentuated wood figure features. We will continue first with strategy 2, it's a bit more complicated, and return to 1 later. To illustrate what I mean by finding the correct sequence, here is the dummy I prepared. Because the wood is bleached, color matching should compensate for it as well. This test is meant to establish the site of colorant addition, which sequence is the most appropriate. An oil stain followed by a shellac glaze, should both be colored, should one of them stay clear? In addition, finding a suitable matting method is needed to match the gloss. On the object itself, we started with the bottom drawer. Here, I have to shorten and report that the test series resulted in this proposed method, with a sequenced application of 2 different ethanol gels. The first, based on a formula Richard Rolbos, which contains carbopol and ethylene, is used to swell and soften the film. It is very effective by itself, but not without risk. Its high alkalinity may damage the underlying oil, and ethylene residues in pores may affect future coating. The second one is used for the actual clearance. This one is based on a thickened solution of the solvent with a high molecular cellulose ether, Clusel, It was fun too weak by itself, and by this I mean that multiple repetitions were needed, therefore it required an increased mechanical action, which we wanted to avoid. And their combination worked really well, and a system of poultices and absorbing envelopes was developed to minimize exposure time and potential residues. Here are test fields from left to right, after removal, after oil application, and testing some variations of color matching sequences. The main breakthrough here is that a single application of clear oil saturated the bleached wood significantly. From all the formulations tested, it appeared that the inherently red stick lac was most suitable as the base solution, and this is due to its lac dye component. Additions of dragon's blood and red solvent dyes were compared, and a good match could be formulated. To achieve color match in strategy 1, here to the right, I had to add solvent brown to the mix. Test fields were evaluated according to different criteria, such as color and gloss match and high contrast from near and far. Testing both strategies resulted in a clear preference for strategy 2. First and foremost, due to the ability of an oil impregnation to resaturate the color and figure of bleached wood. This is most visible here, as you can see, the increased contrast to the left, whereas to the right, the overlaying glazes fail to retain contrast to the crotch figure. It looks much better on the picture, I must say. In reality, it appears slightly blurry, like a color filter or a cast. However, fresh applications result in an improved appearance, which is comparable but does not match yet the target appearance. Therefore, I define these results as preliminary. The complete test series and the different considerations are detailed in my thesis. In these short presentations, I would like to highlight that the proposed selective removal strategy borrows methods from painting conservation, thus offering a more moderate stripping method than the common removal operations in furniture restoration practice. In this regard, it is not uncommon in the practice to overlay shellac with a refreshing coat, as done here in strategy 1. It is generally justified as a minimal intervention method. However, specifically in this case, and if applied to frontal surfaces, it might reflect a misinterpretation of the maker's intent. Strategy 2 revives the decorative function of the frontal veneers. Here, familiarity with historical primary sources assists in interpreting original intention. The improved aesthetic does not only address the owner's demand, but also serves to understand and communicate historical design ideals. As expected, integrating differences in appearance is a challenging task. This could not yet be resolved, but I will continue to work on it. The test series concludes with a palette of possibilities, and at the moment I would like to test strategy 3, 1 for protected surfaces, 2 for degraded. Hopefully I will be able to report the outcomes in the near future. I thank you all for your attention and look forward to a fruitful discussion.
Thank you, Alma, for your great lecture on recoding the surfaces. The Q&A will come after the poster pitches that are next, and we'll start with Lena Gu. Lena is a bachelor student at the Cologne Institute of Conservation, and she will give her talk about a photo-degraded ebony imitation bookcase from the Ludwigsburg Residential Palace. So Lena, please share your screen and go ahead.
Yes, hello. I hope everyone can hear me, and now I will share my desktop.
Yeah. Shayne Rivers, the Valley Great Project, Alma.
So I hope everyone can see my desktop right now. And I will start my presentation. Okay. Hello and welcome to my poster pitch about the investigation of an aged ebony imitation, the black bookcase of Ludwigsburg Residential Palace. In the residential of Ludwigsburg in Germany are the apartments of Queen Charlotte Augusta Mathilde of Württemberg, which contain an ensemble of ebonized furniture in the so-called Toiletzimmer, or in English, dressing room. Two identical ebonized bookcases with drawers belong to the ensemble, where most of the furniture is attributed to Johannes Klinkerfuß, cabinet maker to the court and formerly apprenticed to the renowned ebonist David Röntgen. In preparation for an exhibition to display a reconstruction of the apartment's original arrangements dating to around 1800, the Cologne Institute of Conservation Science was asked to participate in the investigation of selected objects. The bookcase consists of a cuboid case with 3 drawers and an attachment on it, which separates the cover plate in 2 halves and allows us to use it as a shelf for book, etc. from both sides. The furniture is made of solid pierwood and designed as an ebony imitation on the outside. On each short side, the corpus is decorated with handles made of silvered brass. Basic investigations were carried out on the construction, materials, and surfaces of one of the 2 bookcases. Of particular interest was the condition of the ebonized surfaces, which were examined using UV radiation to establish the presence of possible coating layer stratification. It becomes obvious that there are different fluorescences which vary from red, green, and blue. Taking a closer look at the coating, it becomes clear that the object has up to 4 different layers. These layers can be seen at the crossbeam of the bookcase here in figure 3. A glue solvent is applied as a primer, A. Above this base coat, 2 layers with black stain are painted, B. The stain also penetrated into the wood cells, and at least a transparent and slightly shining coating is applied, C. The color of this top layer varies under UV radiation, so there are green and orange fluorescences in the same layer. Another layer fluorescence is bright orange, and this coating D can only be found as a drop on the crossbeam and on the drawer fronts. Under visual light, some areas of the coating C deviate as well from others. Studying the coating more closely, it becomes obvious that some parts have damages induced by photodegradation, here in figure 4. The detailed investigation shows that areas of the surface which are protected from sunlight are less damaged. Especially by the handle on the right side, it can be seen that the shadow of the handle protected the surface in this area and is less damaged than its surrounding, as we can see here in figure 5. Yes, the investigations of the ebony imitation shows that the coating of the bookcase consists of various layers. The UV examination revealed that only the surfaces of the drawer fronts had been refinished, as we could see in figure 2, whereas most of the ebony imitation remains in near original condition, apart from fading caused by light exposure. Furthermore, the analysis of photographic archival records of the dressing room, showing one of the 2 bookcases positioned on a table near a window, allowed to correlate the incident of sunlight with the mapped light damage. Comparing the ebonized furniture of objects of Ludwigsburg, it poses several research questions for further investigation. How do this bookcase and its identical partner fit into the ensemble, as other pieces in the collection context show coatings that cannot be classified as an ebony imitation? Furthermore, which similarities and differences can be identified, and are there possible subgroups? Yeah, now I'm at the end of my poster pitch, and I will thank you for your attention. If there are any questions, you can write it in the chat and I will answer it later. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this excellent pitch, Lena. Next, we have master student Josefin Tönjes from the University of Applied Sciences and Arts in Hildesheim. And Josefin will present an art historical and art technical study of a magnificent late Renaissance cabinet on stand from the Westfries Museum Hoorn, Noordholland. Josefin, here you go.
Yes, one moment. I'm the presentation does not start yet.
I will start your presentation.
Yes. I'm starting it. Can you hear me?
Yes, very
And
well.
I'll try to enable my video, if that's possible. Okay, that's not working.
Don't worry about that.
Yeah, just a second. I had no chance to enable my video. So just for a little. Okay, well then we start without. My presentation is already visible for everyone because I can't forward the slide, or I can't. Seems like the
just tell us
connection
when we have to show the next slide.
Okay, I can't see my own presentation, but I will manage that. Okay, I start now. Yeah, thank you.
And it appears we've lost Josefin for a second. She's reconnecting.
The poster pitch focuses on the technological and art historical aspects of the object. Next slide, please. The technological investigation applied non-invasive methods, and a technical drawing was carried out. The construction shows traditional wood joinery and can be divided into two parts, the cabinet and the later added stand. The cabinet has two doors at the front that reveal a detailed facade. The interior consists of 21 drawers, 6 of them are hidden and only accessible by 2 sliding elements. A centered compartment can be locked by 2 smaller doors. The top of the cabinet can be opened to reveal a large flat compartment, which is visible in the technical drawing. The stand with a large drawer and twisted legs shows marquetry that refers to the marquetry on the cabinet. The cabinet forms the original centerpiece of the objects. The marquetry shows floral moresque-like ornaments, geometric stripes, and men in period clothing on the outer sides. The facade of the interior and the inner sides of the doors feature marquetry of grotesques and figures of Greek muses in combination with architectural decoration and flat relief ornaments. Next slide, please. A variety of European hard and soft woods can be characterized within the marquetry. The colors of the natural and stained wood are considerably faded due to photodegradation. A knothole in the front piece of a drawer allows sight of the reverse of the marquetry. This provides information about the possible original stained color of the veneer. Within the reduced brown tones of the marquetry, a significant use of green wood is noted. The green color is caused by the fungi Chlorociboria. It produces the blue-green pigment silendine, which has a remarkable stability against light. Next slide, please. Based on the acquired information, several later editions were identified, including the stand, the cornice, and parts of the veneer. American sugar maple appears in the marquetry on the stand and as renewed framing stripes on the outer sides of the cabinet. That indicates that these additions occurred at the same time. On the sides, large pieces of renewed sugar maple veneer also cover the evidence of former handles. From the inner sides of the corpus, the nail holes from the mounting are still visible. In the figure, they are marked as red crosses. The features of the cabinet suggest specialized craftsmanship from South Germany and Tyrol in the second half of the 16th until the 17th century. Unlike most cabinets of curiosities, the typical rune ornaments are absent. Elements with fish scale-like carvings, as well as the chessboard-like marquetry stripes, indicate a Tyrolean style, which tended to use folklore elements and combined influences from Italy and South Germany. Next slide, please. In comparison with similar objects, the cabinet of the Westfries Museum shows characteristics that possibly locate its origin to Tyrol in the early 17th century. During the research, a very similar object was identified in the collection of the Landesmuseum Oldenburg in Germany. The design of the architectural elements, and especially the motifs of the grotesques, suggests the use of the same templates. Both objects show between 5 and 7 different designs. In the figures, the linked grotesques are compared. Unfortunately, little is known about the object in Oldenburg, and the given information remains vague. Further details about the two objects would be of interest. Regarding the stand and its twisted legs, further research could also provide a better localization of this edition and the journey of the object. This was a brief snapshot about the Westfries Museum's cabinet. And yeah, I welcome your questions and I thank you for your attention. I'm afraid that I...
Thank you, Josefin.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my connection that's giving me troubles today.
No, don't worry about it. You were loud and clear. And thank you for showing us the secrets of this fine cabinet. Next, we have bachelor student Nele Vanassche from the University of Antwerp. And Nele is in the process of studying the art historical and technical context of a recently discovered gem from the Art and History Museum in Brussels. Nele, please go ahead.
Nele, do you have any technical problems? If so, no, just write it down in the chat.
No, sorry, I forgot to put on the unmute icon. I was already started.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'll start again, please.
Yeah, thank you. So good evening, everyone. I will briefly tell you about the research into a marquetry table from the collection of the Art and History Museum in Brussels. This table was previously dated early 18th century. So in the database of the Belgian Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage, it was dated between 1701 and 1710. And Seymour de Ricci, a historian, placed this table in the Régence period, and that's between 1715 and 1723. However, this dating is now questioned, and I will tell you why in this presentation. So the first part of the research was focused on the construction. And here we see some inconsistencies with 18th century furniture. The egg-shaped stretcher, for instance, deviates from its 18th century counterparts. We could also see some saw marks of a mechanical bandsaw on the underside of the tabletop. And lastly, it seems that the marquetry wasn't intended for this table. And why do we think that? On the tabletop, for instance, here, we see two large motifs instead of one central one. And the latter was much more common in the early 18th century. And if we take a closer look to this region here, like you can see here, we see that the scroll work of both of the large motifs doesn't correspond to the same point. And this seems quite odd, because if it were meant that these two sections were placed directly next to each other, this would have probably been one clean horizontal line. It's very likely that these motifs were once intended for two cabinetors. So one motif for the right cabinettor and one motif for the left cabinettor. And maybe the marquetry was later repurposed on this table. So if the construction is not from the early 18th century, a following question arises, namely, can the marquetry have an early 18th century origin? The imagery on the tabletop, like the flower still lifes and 2 examples of a turquerie, seems to support this. This is here an example of a turquerie. And what is more, prints were found by Anthony de Winter, Caspar Luyken, and Jacques Bailly, which served as inspiration for the design. The most recent prints can be dated circa 1707, which gives us a terminus post quem for the marquetry on the tabletop. So I've selected 2 examples to show the similarities between the prints and the marquetry, but more examples can be found on the poster. The first is a Commedia dell'arte figure by Anthony de Winter on the left. And the second is a flower from Jacques Bailly from the publication of Diverses fleurs mises en bouquet. And this is an interesting one because when gluing the veneer, you can see that the stem and the flower buds were placed in mirror image in contrast to the flower itself. In the next phase of the research, it was questioned whether the dyestuffs on the tabletop would fit the early 18th century wood dyeing tradition. So macro XRF scanning was executed on the right side of the tabletop, and with this we obtained the distribution of several metals. Copper was used for a green color, like you can see in the grasshopper. You can still see a little bit of green, a trace of green in the grasshopper. And iron was used for a black dye. We can also see an overlap between the copper and the potassium map, indicating that these 2 metals were used in the same color recipe. Until now, zinc, nickel, and manganese couldn't be linked to a certain color or color recipe. And what is more, the use of manganese and nickel seemed to fit better in the 19th century, where they used different metal salts to experiment. This could lead to questioning the attribution of the marquetry to the early 18th century, but we also have to consider that the dyes could have been applied sometime after the marquetry was made. So to conclude, is the table from the early 18th century? The construction was not, but based on the imagery of the tabletop, the marquetry can be attributed to the early 18th century. However, some metals were found which could indicate we also have to rethink this dating of the tabletop. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Nele, for sharing your ongoing research. And then last but not least, I would like to welcome Welmoed Krep. Welmoed is an advanced professional program student at the University of Amsterdam, and her poster pitch is her search for materials and techniques to mimic natural turtle surfaces.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name is Welmoed Krep, and thank you all for listening to my talk, and a big thank you to Vincent and Sophie for this great initiative. My talk will be about making infills for turtle shell and selecting materials to imitate turtle shell. My research was prompted by the restoration of early 18th century tabernacle, of which you can see the doors here. The object is still not intact. And the main asset of this tabernacle is its turtle shell veneer and turtle shell moldings. Turtle shell was already in the late 17th century and 18th century one of the most expensive materials, comparable to gold and precious stones. It is harvested from mostly the back plates of 3 species of sea turtles mostly, and because of the use and the demand for this material, these sea turtles have become nearly extinct. So in the 1970s, several treaties have been issued to try to protect these animals and to restrict the hunt for and the trade in this material. But still in conservation, the genuine material is sometimes used if it is available in old stock. But as it has always been expensive, already from the 17th century, a lot of materials were considered and used as imitation materials. So I did research, literature research into what materials can be suitable to make an imitation, and I found that these characteristics of the original material needs to be met. That is a specific varying translucency, homogeneity of the material, the typical 3D stains with a depth into the material, which are very hard to replicate, the potential to be worked into high gloss, the potential to be worked into moldings, for my case, and it is an asset if the stains can be custom applied to match a surrounding material. And it's also an asset in my case if the material has a certain viscosity for application. I found also that in literature it is suggested to use different materials for large infills or for small infills. For large infills, mostly sheet material is used, such as the genuine turtle shell, if it is still in old stock. Stained horn is used, acetate film, and dyed cast resins of polyester or epoxy. For small infills, pliable materials are used, such as pigmented wax, various varnishes and resins, such as copal, shellac, and oil varnishes, and putties of various kinds. And I had to do some additional testing because in literature there was no mention of what material would be suitable to be made into moldings. So I tested some of these materials and I concluded that epoxy filled with fumed silica made the best translucency. And I colored it with aerosol dyes and made the stains with a dark pigment, as the stains are less translucent than the other material. So on my object, I used this this epoxy for the middle-sized lacunae. Here I made a lacuna, I pre-cast that and glued it onto the object. And here I used the epoxy mixture directly onto the object on a barrier layer. And then I worked it with files and other tools into the molding. For the small infills, I used pigmented beeswax, and you can work it and then it looks like this. For this large infill here, I used a genuine material, as we still had that in old stock. That was also for me an occasion to learn to work with the material, but now I realize this, since it is so controversial, that I might have chosen differently if I had done that research differently. And now I realize I should have consulted the stakeholders and owner to see whether I should use this genuine material or not. So concluding, it is difficult to replicate turtle shell, but when you select the proper materials for the infill at hand, you can achieve good results. So thank you all for listening to my talk.
Thank you, Welmoed, for this interesting poster presentation. We have some questions from the audience. So we'll have a short Q&A session, but we'll try to answer as much questions as possible. Okay, everyone, well, Alma, could you turn your microphone, because we have firstly some questions for you. Vincent, go ahead.
Yes. So the first question comes from Craig Deller. He asked the following: did you find that aged shellac coatings will shift from orange to green under UV fluorescence with its exposure to light over time? And if so, do you know why?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I was wondering also why. I mean, I know it is typical that, as mentioned, that light exposure does this effect, and light exposure is a photo-oxidation process. So I would just imagine that chemically it has something to do with it, but it's a very common observation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And so we have another question. Have you thought about experimenting with more photo-stable colorants?
Again, experimenting with?
So with more photo-stable colorants instead of the stick lac and the dragon's blood.
Yes, I did test dragon's blood just to just as a reference, but in the end I use Orasol dyes, which are metal complexes, and lac dye in itself is relatively stable. I mean the red component in the sticker.
Okay, so Sophie,
like the
up to
light
you.
fastness is 6 to 7, yeah. As opposed to dragon's blood, which is 3 to 4, blue wool scale.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Sophie?
Yes, we have a question for Josefin. Were you able to discover the use of a sandwich technique for the marquetry, or were all the pieces of the marquetry cut individually?
A sandwich technique. Well, I've noticed that the outer sides were made with probably made in a double cut technique. Double cut intarsia, and we also had the geometric stripes. They were made, if you mean this was sandwich technique, as a block intarsia, so-called block intarsia. I don't know whether it's a proper translation. Yeah, I noticed different techniques in the marquetry, and there were also some were exceptionally cut and some were exceptionally like details that were cut, and the rest was sawn. So I've noticed some differences, but yeah, it was the very first time that this object has been researched, and so I summarized the techniques more than research them individually.
Okay, thank you. That's clear. Then a question for Lena. Could you turn your microphone on?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes. Did you get the impressions the coatings themselves might have been colored black, or are they not colored?
So the coating is not colored, it's the layer. So the stain which is under the coating, which photo-degraded. And you can see this coating in 2 different colors, so in the UV radiation.
And do you have any idea which coatings might have been used?
I think there are 2 coatings on the stain. So there is one layer which is only on the surfaces from the draw fronts. Yeah, the bright orange one I described. And there's also the one coating which is yeah, in this green and orange fluorescence. And this is yeah, mostly the original coating. And the brownish orange is the original one, which is not photo-degraded.
And then Vincent has some questions for Nele, I guess.
Yes, Nele, could you turn on your microphone, please?
Yes,
So first question comes from our colleague Julia Schulz from the University of Applied Sciences and Arts, Hildesheim. And she says the following. So first of all, Nele, very interesting research. Is the object varnished, and could the manganese come from oil containing varnish with cicatives?
The object is indeed varnished. It's likely that it's shellac varnish. But the manganese was found very locally, so you can clearly see the borders of the veneer pieces. It was found in 2 veneer pieces. So I thought directly of dye stuff, but maybe an oil-containing varnish was used very locally. So yeah, that's a good idea or a good thought process.
Okay, thank you. And then I have a second question for you.
Mm-hmm.
So one notices that it's a nice find of the prints. How did you find them, and are these known sources for marquetry, for example?
I found these prints surfing on the internet, in fact, and I don't think they are known sources. I think it's I didn't find any other furniture based on these prints, but maybe maybe there's something out there that I don't know, probably.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Back to Sophie for the last questions.
Yes, I have some questions for Welmoed. One by Irene Meneghetti, or Irene. How did you recreate the 3D staining? I guess in the epoxy cast that was. And she says, very interesting topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I prepared several pastes of my epoxy mixture, mixed with different aerosol dyes. So a light one, yellowish, and then a reddish orange one, and one with a lot of pigment in it. And then I could mix them on the object or in my mold with brushes or sticks to mix the colors, and then to mix the pigmented epoxy into it, and that made the stains, because that pigment is also a little powdery, like the turtle shell stains are.
Okay, thank you. Then Alma has a question. How did you prepare this separate cast you made of the pigmented epoxy?
Well, yeah, I made molds. I made a silicone cast of very fluid silicone of a part of the object, and that fluid silicone already created such a flat surface that my object, when it came out of the mold, already had that flat surface, which had a very high shine already. So then I could even also incorporate some of the damage, but I still had to fill a little bit between the object and the infill, but that worked quite well.
And one final question, and that's mine actually. Since you applied all these different techniques, which one did you prefer?
Well, I think I would still make a difference between a small infill and a large infill. So if I had to do that really large infill again, then I would, I think, use the cast option, where I cast the epoxy, and for small infills it works better if you apply the epoxy directly onto the object and then shape it onto the object, so you don't have any cracks between the original and the new material. And yeah, for the small work, the wax worked best.
Okay, thank you, Alma, Lena, Josefin, Nele, and Welmoed.
Okay, thank you, Sophie. So this brings us to the end of our first ConNext session. I first and foremost like to thank our keynote speaker, Shayne Rivers, and a big thank you for all the speakers of today: Chen Liao, Franziska Eber, Alma Ben Yossef, Lena Gu, Josefin Tönjes, Nele Vanassche, and Welmoed. I also would like to thank our institutes and our partners for ConNext, and of course you as the audience for making this event happen. So our next session, dealing with the elements, with keynote speaker Adrian Smith from the Royal Collection Trust, will be next Monday, same time, same place, and will be hosted by Sophie Gelerum and Andreas Krupa. Thank you very much, and bye.
Bye-bye.